Now I'll pass over to Kimana Zulueta-Fuelscher, Acting Head of the Constitution Building Programme at International IDEA and PSRP partner, who is our chair today.
Thank you so much, Harriet, and also thanks to Christine Bell for inviting me to moderate this discussion. Welcome also from my side to this webinar on transitional arrangements. We have an excellent panel of speakers today, starting with Professor Christine Bell, who of course does not need any introduction, but let me just say that she's the mastermind behind the Political Settlements Research Program at the University of Edinburgh. And Christine will very briefly explain why the Political Settlements Research Program is actually interested in transitional arrangements and the extent to which the Political Settlements Research Program has addressed these types of arrangements. So Christine, without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So I just wanted to say a few words at the beginning by way of introduction to the topic to set the scene for what follows. This is one of a number of events we're having that really sort of celebrates in ways a body of work that has come out in an area. We had one on aspects of our gender work on Wednesday. And in the last 2 years, we really dug into issues that we had sort of seen from data we were exploring around peace agreements and in the field that there was not so much research on. And one of those was really the design and implementation of what we sort of calling transitional arrangements. And I wanted to say a bit about what we understood those to be. So transitional arrangements are often involve a ceasefire coupled with an arrangement of the warring parties, often a government and non-state actors, going into some sort of power sharing, temporary, time limited, often with quite tight timescales, joint government as a sort of appointed government, often appointed by themselves through the negotiations process. And alongside that, then various reform processes are put in place, forms of constitutional reform and reconstruction, forms of security sector reform and reconstruction, and forms of economic reform. I think one of the biggest surprises in collecting data about peace processes was how prevalent this kind of design model of exiting from both conflict, but also situations of violent social crisis this was. So this kind of loose model is used, is fairly ubiquitous. I think we think of peace processes and agreements about reaching a comprehensive agreement, but in fact, this is almost an alternative model of brokering an end to conflict. It's often used in situations where there's both been a democratic failure and a level of conflict and violence. So for example, full-scale conflict, such as in Yemen, but also social crisis, such as in places like the Gambia, and also attempts to navigate incumbents who haven't conceded post-elections out of power. For example, this modality was used really to try to set up a transition in 2008 in Zimbabwe. What have we been interested in? Well, we've been interested in a whole set of issues as to what are the design features at the detail of how governments are put together, what the reform processes are, and whether people do actually exit at the end of the transition and what they exit into. I'm not going to go into that because our speakers will address those issues, but I wanted to point to 3 things that in ways frame some of the difficulties for support to these processes. First of all, that our experience is they often don't transit through very well. There's often tight timetables, and yet events change, including even the conflict actors. So sometimes transitions and very often they're outpaced by events in the field. And this creates a need for adaptive management. And a lot of the research that's posted in the links talks about adaptive management. And our view is that adaptive management should be pre-planned for in the design of these processes. So it's good to set timetables, but if those timetables are then things that cause international stuff to breach their own agreement, then they can be not so good to be designed in quite that way. So the second big take home collectively from the research has been that there needs to be ongoing brokerage during the transition between political and military elites at the heart of government themselves, who often will have engaged in the government with very, very different endpoints in mind for the transition. They usually won't have given up on their battlefield goals completely. And also between those elites and the wider civil society that will have to be involved and will often be involved in the broader reform processes, partly because these are about reconstructing not just a deal for government, but a social contract and a social fabric and a way of the state functioning through beyond the transition point. I think the third thing, which is maybe an uneasy conclusion, is that often not these transitions really extend for a long period of time. I think international actors like projects of timescales and to know when they're leaving. But we think that actually maybe one of the ways of approaching there's sort of the never-ending transition is also to understand that it is itself a governance forum and a forum for change. So we can see where the discussion goes with that and return to it. But if the approach is to convene and broker, then these transitions are themselves spaces of convening and brokering a whole range of stakeholders. And therefore, the idea of termination is a complicated one. So with that said, I hope that sets the scene a bit on what we're talking about, what the broad findings for our research are that I hope we're going to touch on today before handing back to Kimana. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christine. This gives us a really good starting point for the rest of the webinar. I'd now like to introduce Dr. Iago Salman, who has recently been appointed as head of the UN Resident Coordinator's Office in Bosnia-Herzegovina. He was previously a program manager at CIPRI and a non-resident fellow with the Center for International Cooperation at NYU, and also the co-author of a very well-known joint report by the UN and the World Bank, Pathways for Peace. So Dr. Salman will be presenting today on the role of international actors in transition management out of a report published for the Political Settlements Research Program. The floor is yours, Jago. You remain muted, sorry.
Even after a year. Thank you, Zanaya, and thank you, Christine and PSRP, for allowing me to make some remarks at this event. It's great to be here with such a distinguished group of panelists, and great to see many well-known faces in the audience as well. So this discussion, when I was asked to write the report previously, discussion is really an opportunity for me to step back and reflect on a topic which has occupied much of my career between the development pillars and the peace and security pillars of the UN. I have to just again emphasize I speak in my personal capacity, partly because the transitional arrangements in Bosnia, for many people, remain in place today, 25 years since Dayton. So why is this discussion, I think, so important right now? I mean, as Christine mentioned, interim governance arrangements or transitional governments have always existed, whether imposed at the end of military victory, for example, or as a legal project after democratic transition. They serve practical functions in allowing the legal exercise of public power following a non-constitutional rupture. They are the transition, in theory, until the restoration of constitutional order. There are many, many different types of transitional arrangements, and it's very hard to generalize across contexts. The reason it's so important today, I think, is because increasingly such interim authorities are being tasked not only as custodians of public power, but they're also being entrusted by populations and by the wider international community as the vehicles for wider reforms, wider peace building and state building reforms. They have become really, since the challenged experiences of direct administration in Timor, Kosovo, and Iraq, one of the, if not the most preferred response to major conflicts by the international community. This places transitional governments from a UN perspective and from member states at the center of efforts to secure international and regional peace and security. Previously, they were frequently introduced with comprehensive peace agreements containing detailed roadmaps and milestones. For those who remember the CPA in Sudan, it was thick enough to hold up a computer at times. In recent years, however, we have been faced with complex political transitions, popular uprisings, or civil unrest that have resulted in expert, provisional, or other forms of interim arrangements that lack that level of detail. In other words, the international community is still working with transitional governments as a preferred response to major conflicts, but we have fewer and fewer roadmaps. There is no recipe for the effective management of transitions, but as a basis for building our knowledge, the political settlements research really provides a rich source of comparison and data. It provides evidence on the ingredients of what makes a transition successful. It really is, at the end of the day, as somebody pointed out in the previous conversation, the mediators and diplomats directly involved in accompanying and supporting these transitions, who are the chefs that make these successful or not. So the focus of the report that I wrote with PSRP is not, to be clear, on the unintentional or normative role of international action, say the impact of democracy or statehood on transitional governments, but really trying to unpack some reflections on what the material entry points and impact of international action are on national transitions. The paper is based on experience across the Middle East and Africa with the UN, both from policy and from country, as well as a wide degree of reading. It's a reflective paper more than a detailed quantitative analysis or qualitative analysis. So just in this brief presentation, I'll cover three things that are fleshed out in the report. First is, what is the role of international action in transitions? Secondly, a broad typology of what we mean by international support for transitions. And then thirdly, which is where I think a lot of interest is in the dilemmas faced by international action here. So the role of international actors, firstly. So often brought in, as Christine said, during moments of profound crisis, transitional governments must preserve basic economic and political stability and security as caretakers. At the same time, they're increasingly expected to undertake what are very often controversial reforms to render the state functional in key areas. Christine elaborated some of them, but in many of these areas, we're looking at sector reforms or ministerial reforms that allow for the reestablishment of security and the renewal of rule of law, ending of impunity, the restarting of public governance processes, and institutions able to reconcile social conflict and pursue collective goals of prosperity and development. The restarting of systems of service delivery as a basis for peace dividend, and the restoring of macroeconomic stability, in theory as a basis for creating livelihoods and employment as a pathway to sustainable development. In these reforms, transitions have always involved the political or diplomatic capacity and the development capacity of member states, the multilateral system, but they have historically been viewed very much as linear progressions, moving from conflict to peace or authoritarianism to democracy. International support has in turn often been heavily sequenced, moving from humanitarian relief, mediation to development. The interesting conundrum and opportunity, I think, with interim governance arrangements is that they blur all of these divisions, because they themselves, as governance arrangements, are tasked with managing all of these processes at the same time. What that means for an interim government is that they are constantly walking a very delicate line between maintaining core political agreements, for example, on not resorting to violence for political power, while at the same time undertaking reforms that are often highly technical and often highly controversial. So just some ideas of this. Some of the reforms that are required to stabilize the state and the peace require things like redirecting resource flows and breaking patronage networks. For example, downsizing the wage bill or cutting subsidies. They require looking at the economic model, often entrenched over decades of authoritarian rule. Looking, for example, at revoking export licenses or changing financial banking regulations. And at the end of the day, very directly, they are looking at questions of institutional control, most prominently probably command and control of security forces. But if we look at some cases, questions of staffing of universities have proven, which were entrenched with political party elites, have proven to be equally controversial. So what this really means is for transitional governments is for that managing transition requires forming and sustaining coalitions, both on maintaining overall peace and stability while advancing specific reforms required to stabilize the country. In this process, a successful transition is not one that designs one aspect perfectly, one sector perfectly, but one that ensures sufficiently capable functions across key areas. In this process, international actors have often sort of worked from the outside as providing assistance to transitional governments. But one of the arguments I'll make is, in many ways, international actors are direct stakeholders in both of the settlements that come out of the process and in the process itself. They are formally called upon in this, both as shareholders in the international system and as bilateral partners to transitional governments for support. And why they often aspire to this is a constant gripe that international actors would like more control over policy decisions by transitional governments. Very rarely, if ever, do international actors have the personnel, resources, or the knowledge that would allow them to control political settlements or national transitions. So instead, they are shareholders. They're asked to invest, but without executive control. In terms of what international actors are asked to invest, transition agreements frequently recognize three roles in writing. Firstly, they call upon the international system or specific member states to act as guarantors of transitional arrangements, punishing defection, for example, from transitional governments. They are called upon to offer technical assistance in the process of institutional reform, and then very prominently, they're asked for money. They're asked to provide finance. Even more frequently, in some cases, agreements actually extend from finance to call international partners to provide security assistance as well during critical periods. Political support. What do we mean by political support, which is often a fairly sort of ephemeral category? The international architecture, the multilateral system, is in many ways designed as a bank, designed to lend aspects of sovereignty to national governments, resources, and troops, most visibly. States, at the end of the day, hold the authority for most of these decisions, including the votes on multilateral boards, resources, volume of resources, and policy over what conditionalities are applied. It is very often other member states, either globally or very frequently the neighborhood, who make a lot of the decisions that define whether transitional governments will be supported or not, and whether they will be buttressed with stability or face instability. Much of the mandate and resources, however, for this support sits with multilateral institutions, the World Bank, the UN, the EU. And as such, when transitional governments are appealing to international actors, in many cases, this requires formal political support in the form of votes to access the resources from the multilateral system. From my house in the UN, the clearest single variable for a long time in this process has been the vote of support from the UN Security Council. The Security Council provides not only a range of operational responses, from directing the terms or principles by which a conflict should be resolved, to authorizing the deployment of political and peacekeeping operations. But one of the other areas the Security Council also provides, which is perhaps less focused on, is in its resolutions, it provides a minimum of collectively agreed analysis and mandate of priorities for operational responses. However, increasingly, we are seeing transitions being supported less by peace operations, but more by, following the UN reforms in particular, by reinforced UN resident coordinators and country teams, buttressed by political capacity, the human rights capacity, and others in a variety of hybrid operations. In fact, in many, if not most cases of transitions, the Security Council actually remains silent. In any case, the confidence of other member states in interim government, whether bilaterally or multilaterally, is critical in determining how much support and what kind of support an interim government can access. Technical assistance. So technical assistance, international actors are a source of technical advice, knowledge, and comparative experience in transition processes. The diversity of sources for such assistance is truly vast compared to the political support that's required. Multilateral organizations, states are definitely a source of this, but at the same time, regional organizations, non-state actors, and businesses are increasingly available to provide support. There is a wide diversity of transnational non-state actors operating alongside the state-based international order. The last point in technical assistance is it's often understood again as assistance, as building capacity of national systems and institutions. However, in key areas, from security sector to macro fiscal management, this technical advice, it has two edges to it. It's essential to build the capacity, but in many cases, it's also a prerequisite to align national institutions and law with international legal or regulatory frameworks. In specific circumstances, such alignment must be confirmed to allow for transitional governments to integrate effectively into national systems. Probably the most prominent example of this is to allow money from the IFIs to flow, which requires a clean bill of health from the IMF, debt clearance, and so on. But you also have other areas, for example, exports through ports, require similar bills of health from the International Maritime Organization. Therefore, this advice is rarely solely technical. And the particular point I'd like to make is often in the very early stages of transitions, up to 18 months, international advice to national partners can be extraordinarily influential in determining outcomes and setting parameters on the political settlement. At the end of the day, however, beyond the political support and the technical assistance, what is very, very visible is the request for financial assistance. This is an area that's becoming increasingly complicated, not necessarily negatively, but is increasingly complicated. With the majority of development issues focused increasingly in fragile states and peace and conflict issues increasingly impacting middle and high income countries, international financial institutions are of increasing importance, both in the provision of support, but particularly in setting the terms of monetary cooperation and financial stability. The caveat around the financial assistance is that ODA and development is an essential source of financing for interim governments, both in volume and quality. However, traditional development responses, which are slow, on budget, often do not allow for accelerated responses to communities' expectations in the face of crisis. On the flip side, humanitarian aid, which can quickly respond to a large-scale crisis, is rarely delivered, if ever delivered, through national systems or on budget. As a result, even when volumes of aid are high, the quality of financing can be, if not more important, in determining the ability of transitional governments to marshal financing to support a transition.
Jago, can I very quickly interrupt and say that you have 2 more minutes?
That's fine, thank you. One example of that is that a relatively small proportion of finance is allocated to core peacebuilding objectives that administrations are tasked with delivering. In 2015, only 4% of ODA was delivered to legitimate politics, 2% for security, and 3% for justice. I was going to mention something about spoilers, which I think is useful in general terms, but is often an oversimplification of international engagement. What I'll do is I'll skip to the dilemmas part. So both the nature of transition and the very high fragmentation of international support produces real dilemmas for international action. No single international actor has the resources, mandate, or breadth to mandate support for transitions in isolation. In theory and practice, transitional governments lead. Often they lack the capacity. And in context of weakened democratic accountability, this creates real winners and losers, poses real dilemmas for ownership. So I'll just mention quickly 3 of the bigger dilemmas for international support. One is ownership. Absent a clear consensus on the rules of the game, post-conflict polities raise the question of ownership by who, for what reasons, for how long. Resources provided by states are at the end of the day the produce of tax payments at home. So, but at the same time, where transitions are highly internationalized, we've seen repeatedly that international interests have damaged the ability of national actors to form stable political settlements. One broad agreement on how to address this has been to insist that as much as is possible, even without democratic mandate, transitional processes are inclusive. through popular consultations and dialogue. A second major dilemma for international action is coordination. Active coordination is not just key to mobilize support, but is also key to ensure that the silos of international decision-making do not work at cross purposes, for example, between the Security Council and World Bank Board of Directors. There is a need, ideally, for a holistic visioning and planning system that links these sectors and avoids ad hoc, piecemeal, fragmented inputs, but this is not baked into the international system. The absence of a plan can create medium-term and long-term problems for transitional governments as they balance short-term and long-term priorities and trade-offs. The third area of major dilemmas is sequencing. This impacts both transitional governments and international actors alike, which is the behavioral reality is that when faced with immediate crises, all actors put less weight on the future relative to the present. Dominated by short-term political survival, there is a desire to focus on the immediate rather than establish new and political constitutional rules of the game. Countries get caught in transition traps, in which although time passes, the presence of constant crisis inhibits progress. This is particularly true with financing, where interim governments are often mobilizing short-term project-based funding while struggling to establish the track record needed to establish long-term development assistance. So in conclusion, recognizing both the importance and complexity of transition processes, the international community is moving away from binary support or linear models. This is very much work in progress, but the Sustaining Peace Resolutions of 2016 and the, for example, scale up of financing the IFIs provide opportunities for a more integrated model of support to transitional governments. Sudan, for example, has a vast array of international actors willing to support their transition. But what we don't yet have is an integrated model of support for transition. As Christine was pointing to, ongoing mediation support. There is the need for sustained engagement. These remain challenging in the current moment. However, perhaps there is, however, growing awareness of the importance of inclusivity. The last point I'll make, though, is where there is a need is for more flexible financing. The use of country platforms bringing together international partners has gained traction, but is very ad hoc. Multi-donor trust funds remain mixed. And we are far away from enabling a harmonized approach to approving, dispersing, and monitoring financing over individual projects or programs and transitions. The result is that interventions to support transitions are often based on the assumption that policies aimed at navigating complex processes are mutually reinforcing. In reality, there is little evidence to support the idea that all good things come together. There are significant tensions and trade-offs between building short-term confidence in a political settlement and addressing long-term institutional reforms. Rather than imposing outcomes and being blamed for these trade-offs, often the most constructive external role of international partners has been to combine mediation to facilitate agreement with national actors while building safety nets, fiscal and economic, security, human and social, to protect transitional governments from inevitable shocks. Thank you for the remarks, and I'll stop there and hand over back to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Salmon, for a very good, very comprehensive, very clear presentation. We will continue now with Samit Bisaria. Samit is currently the Constitution Advisor of the UN Department for Peace Building and Political Affairs. He will also be speaking in his personal capacity. He was previously the head of International IDEA's Constitution Building Program, position that we at International IDEA hope he will return to very soon. And Samit will be presenting some key findings of a report jointly published by the Political Settlements Research Program and International IDEA on exactly the same theme, interim governance arrangements in post-conflict and fragile settings. Samit, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Kimana, and thanks to Christine and everyone at the Political Settlements Research Program for the invitation. Pleasure to be here with all of you and my esteemed panelists. I'm hoping that you can see my screen. I'm going to show some pictures and hopefully about 6 slides or 7 slides. What I'm going to be speaking about is is this report on interim governance arrangements in post-conflict and fragile settings, which sort of came out of a expert and practitioner workshop that International IDEA held with Edinburgh University and the Political Settlements Research Project and Centre of Constitutional Law back in December of 2019, which is bittersweet because I think it was the last real sort of meeting of this sort that I was in before the pandemic struck. So in talking through the reports, I will speak about sort of what are the components, forces, and mechanisms around international interim governance arrangements, challenges and stumbling blocks, and some suggestions that the report makes to ease pressure. As Kimana mentioned, I will be speaking in my personal capacity. I would like to be able to say something like the positions, that I sort of expound upon are my own and not those of the United Nations, but I'm not even sure I have very many positions to speak of on these subjects because in rereading the report and in preparing my remarks, what I found is that probably most of the people in this room are aware of the challenges that I'm going to lay out. I'm just not sure that we've yet, as a community, certainly I speak for myself, thought very much or thought enough really about the solutions, certainly in the face of the many problematic transitions, collapsed transitions, stalled transitions that we see around the world today. So on that cheerful note, here's a nice picture. Interim governance arrangements are a bridge towards a peaceful, inclusive, and democratic government. I shall come back to that notion in just a second. But essentially, there's two things happening on this bridge. One is that you have a temporary body or bodies who are responsible for governing the country for a finite period. And the second thing is that you have a series of reform processes that are put in place to end the transition and set the country on its way to a new future, right? So the characteristics that we normally find here are that you're in a situation where elections are not possible, either because of the situation on the ground, the conflict, or because the very reason that we are in the conflict in the first place is because people didn't like the rules around elections and they didn't like the rules around governance, and that led to a conflict. So we can't have elections under those old rules and we need new rules. New rules require a process or a body or bodies with some sort of legitimacy that can make those new rules by which we all consent to be governed. And without elections, one way that we find the legitimacy necessary for that body or bodies or process is through inclusion rather than a democratic mandate, right? So often we see power sharing governments and other mechanisms of inclusion, of which there's a surprising variety. Right, and then, just the report, which is linked to in your chat, goes into all these things in a lot more detail than I have time for today, but some of the factors that influence the nature of the reform process are the balance of power between the parties, the negotiating strength essentially of the different parties, the strength or legitimacy of existing institutions. So for example, the two cases we had at the workshop were Sudan and South Sudan, and they differ in this respect in that in Sudan, essentially, the existing institutions were thrown out. Constitutional declaration was made, which abolished the previous constitution, whereas in South Sudan, the peace agreement, thick and heavy and long as it is, did not abolish the existing institutions nor the existing constitution. The type of crisis, for example, crises relating to post-electoral violence or electoral disputes, may be narrower in their sort of scope of reforms under the interim governance arrangements than broad-based civil war transitions, symbolic need for change, the pre-existing legal framework, but also the nature of parties. And this is, I think, rather an important one because, in some cases, the ANC in South Africa, Solidarity in Poland, which if you can see, this poster behind me is a Solidarity poster from the 1980s. I think that they went into a transition with enough sort of stored up legitimacy and public trust to be able to negotiate transitions without the extensive level of public consultations and additional sort of legitimacy donating processes that we see in a lot of transitions today. And one might compare that with some parties that are coming out of conflict who carry their constituents through essentially financial reward and patronage. And those lead to different type, those obviously have significant impacts on the way that the process is structured, the kinds of demands that those leaders need to make in order to reward their constituents. How the Taliban in Afghanistan would approach such a thing, right? How do the Taliban bring their constituents with them? Is it a case of a war that has been fought on ideology and therefore their demands around how the process is structured, but also what comes out the other side in form of a new or amended constitution? There needs to be some reward for their constituents in terms of the ideology. This is what you fought for. This is what many of your loved ones died for. Or is it about posts in government and influence on power? Right. Well, the thing that falls out of all of these factors is, well, what space is there left for agency, and especially agency of international mediators or international parties? And this was something that was running through my head as Jago spoke about his remarks. And I'm not sure. I mean, obviously it varies, but I find in certain processes, there's really not much agency left for international actors once all of these contextual considerations have shaped the process. Now, in the workshop, we had this bridge metaphor running for 2 days. And Finn Kasem, who is soon to be the special representative of the Secretary General for South Sudan, kept reminding us that the bridge itself is not paradise. The bridge is the bridge to paradise, which is the end of the transition. As I read the report coming from the workshop, this bridge metaphor runs through the report as well. But I find that metaphor quite problematic. So for me, it's more of an obstacle course. This photo is from one of my son's favorite TV shows. It's called Beastmaster. And our intrepid young participants here must leap from obstacle to obstacle to get through the course. And all the while, these obstacles are sinking into a lake of lava, right? So the problem with the bridge metaphor is that it goes from point A to point B. I find that the way that the transitions that we work in these days are structured is we don't really know what point B is. There's several possible destinations. And it's not really a bridge at all, but it's a series of obstacles. And when it comes to the constitution making process, I find that unfortunately, the process itself is maybe creating more obstacles than need to be there. So here's the constitution making processes of South Sudan and Sudan and the different bodies that are involved at a minimum. And that there may well be more bodies that come into the process through civil society or even different forms of adaptive management, which may be necessary along the way, right? So in South Sudan, you start with a workshop of the parties to design the process and establish a commission. At the same time, there is some sort of committee that will prepare for a national conference. You have the national conference, then the national legislature, is acting as a constituent assembly, receives and approves the draft. And in Sudan, they have all these bodies that are in different peace agreements or in the constitutional declaration, leading to a referendum. And I'd say, I mean, a couple of things, right? So one is, this all looks really very difficult to me because each one of these bodies is an occasion for negotiation. It's also an occasion for the process to get blocked and for arguments and disputes to come out, right? And the positive way of looking at this is, well, by having these different bodies, small bodies, large bodies, expert bodies, political bodies, you have a refraction of societal and political interests, which all come together and lead to a constitution which is broadly adapted to the context and meets the interests of all the parties, as well as sort of being reflective of the hopes and fears of the public at large. But empirically, I'm not sure that that has many times been the case. And more often than not, these processes have proven to fall under their own weight. You know, and there's this quotation from a British constitutional lawyer, Ivor Jennings, who said, you know, well, on the surface of it, it seems very sensible that you should let the people decide, but actually it's ridiculous because before the people can decide, someone must decide who are the people. And that's right, right? So in these interim processes, there are mechanisms designed to basically reflect and represent the will of the people. But I think somehow these processes are overambitious. And rather than seeking to actually find accurate representations of the people in their entirety, or even processes which achieve the consent of the people, a base ambition that one could build upon, but a fundamental base ambition should be a process which is acquiesced to by as many people as possible. If you can get to that, then perhaps you can broaden the process out. But I would suggest that that goal would result in a much simpler, more streamlined process with many less steps than most of these constitution-making processes that we find around the world today.
Ahmed, if I may ask you to wrap up.
Yeah, I got 2 slides, so 2 minutes, hopefully. Challenges. As Jago said, I think most of us now are aware of the advantages and the necessity of inclusion, but how much inclusion is a very difficult question, and that always has to be balanced with efficiency. And a lot of inclusion means that it's much harder to get to a decision. Challenges around the decision-making process, if we flick back to this slide, there's actually nothing that tells us how any of these bodies are going to make their decisions, nor if they can overrule or amend the decisions made by the bodies previous to them. That's another potential source of an unnecessary dispute during the process. Sequencing and timelines, Jago's touched upon, as did Christine, but also I would highlight the changing nature of the conflict. Processes are sort of designed around a map of the actors, but then when that conflict changes, and it seems to change these days a lot, especially because of the role of international actors in domestic conflicts, suddenly the process that has been designed no longer matches the conflict at hand. I'm going to skip over these stumbling blocks that are in the report, maybe highlight just 1 or 2 here. Unclear mandates, the examples I gave from Sudan and South Sudan, it's very hard to understand exactly what are the mandates of these different bodies vis-a-vis the constitution-making process. Transitions within transitions, as well as the difficulties of adaptive management. I think that the current process in Libya is very interesting for this reason. So you sort of have a transition which is defined by the political agreement. Then that stalls after a while, but then there's such a thing called the Libya Political Dialogue Forum, which gets together enough sort of important political will to put another transition on top of the original transition, which is supposed to get to elections now by December of this year. How that will work out is yet to be seen, but if successful, perhaps a good example of adaptive management. So lastly, what do we really mean by adaptive management? And that is sort of one of the main recommendations of the paper is we should have more adaptive management in transitions. They rarely work as they're supposed to, as they're designed. And one recommendation of the paper is that we should think about rotating positions within interim governance institutions. I don't really have my own position on that, but I thought I would raise it because it's interesting and it's something that I've not seen very often. Would it provide incentives for people actually to get things done during the transition when they are rotated into power and before they get rotated out of power? Second one is political unsettlements in the way used by Christine and Jan Popsil in their paper, obviously, which, I mean, to give a very concrete example, there was a recent militia leader in South Sudan who put forward a demand about revenue sharing and how much revenue should be shared between the states. Rather than argue about this percentage or that percentage of revenue sharing, would a more sensible goal be to agree on a procedure for deciding revenue sharing in the future, right? And thirdly, defaults and belays. I'm not a rock climber, and I don't even know if this is a photo of a belay. But the way I understand the belay as it's relevant for us here today is as you're climbing the rock, you sort of attach anchors into the rock at various intervals so that when you fall all the way down, you actually don't fall all the way down, you just fall down as far as the last anchor that you put into the wall. And I think maybe sort of iterative agreements along the way in the process may be something worth more consideration, because what seems to happen in a lot of cases, take for example Libya, is that you get to a point where it's no longer sustainable to be in the transition, and you've got to have elections almost no matter what the cost. And so then at that point, the question is, what is the constitutional basis for these elections? And I think perhaps more thought should be given early on in the transition to what is the bare minimum that we would have as our default? What's our kind of floor upon which we can build through all kinds of inclusive and participatory processes, but what are the core issues of constitutional nature that need to be resolved before we get to elections? And in South Sudan, they sort of did that with one issue, which was they decided in the pre-transitional period, before the transitional government was formed, that they should decide state boundaries and borders. And it was very contentious, and the body they set up to decide that didn't really come out with an agreement, but then there was a political agreement that they would return to 10 states. And again, how that turns out in the long term and the rest of the transition remains to be seen. But I would say that kind of thinking about, can we sort of get some decisions on the really critical issues quite early on, and perhaps through a less inclusive and participatory process than is necessary for the rest of these decisions, gives us some sort of floor, so that when the transition collapses, if it does, or if it gets to a point where we can no longer be in transition, there is some sort of default there for us to move forward out of transition. I should stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for a presentation with a lot of food for thought. It raises a lot of questions, which I'm sure we will discuss in the Q&A. But let me now introduce you, Katia Papagianni, our last presenter. It's a pleasure for me to introduce her. She's the Director of Policy and Mediation Support at the Geneva-based Humanitarian Dialogue Center. Katia will give us the perspective from the mediation field and the role of mediation in supporting transitions, and sometimes perhaps even the survival of interim governance arrangements. Katia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kimana, and thank you to Christine and the PRSP team for inviting me to this discussion. I also remember very happily the December 2019 physical get-together, and I hope we'll be able to repeat that sometime not too far in the future. I feel like actually most of what I wanted to say has already been stated, and I agree with everything that my colleagues have presented and shared with us today. I very much agree with the obstacle course imagery that Summit shared, and with the whole questioning of whether we're talking about a bridge to something, and questioning whether there is a point B that we all know ahead of time and we're actually going to through these transitions, or whether we actually end up in a completely different point X farther down the line. But let me go back to my points that I had prepared, and hopefully they will be useful contributions to our reflection today. So I was going to make it just a very quick point, maybe 10 minutes, Kimana, on two types of scenarios that we encounter. One, transitional arrangements that follow negotiated interim settlements or interim agreements that, as Christine said, settle conflicts not definitively, but rather open up the space for continued negotiation on a number of political, security, economic, and other issues, with the goal, with the ambition, the hope to lead to a more final quotation marks settlement at the end of the line. As Christine said, in our experiences in the mediation field, these are definitely ubiquitous agreements. The the dream of the comprehensive negotiated settlement is very much a dream these days, unfortunately, and we're all working for smaller negotiated outcomes, less ambitious, more transitional, more time-bound than we were about a decade ago. The second scenario that I wanted to bring to the discussion, which I don't think fits Christine's definition and might be completely a bit of left field for our discussion, but I wanted to bring it here, especially given developments in Myanmar and other parts of the world, and that is the question of transitional arrangements that follow unconstitutional changes of government that are led by militaries, but, and I'm not saying that this is the case in Myanmar, but in other cases, but promise reform processes that are supposed to lead a return to democracy. And for the mediation community, maybe not that much for the rest of the international community or not all parts of the international community, but for the mediation community, this scenario are very challenging in terms of whether to engage, how to engage, through what means to engage. Just going back to the first scenario of the transitional arrangements that follow negotiated interim agreements, I just had three observations, reflections from the point of view of a mediation peacemaking practitioner. And the first, in a way, has already been mentioned and elaborated a lot by Jago, and that is the fact that we simply don't have an integrated international approach to support these transitions. Now, this means that the mobilization and maintenance of a unified international coalition that is politically behind a transitional arrangement, transitional process, in most cases is missing. And the reality is that in many cases, we are observing not just lack of unity, but also competition of visions, contradictory visions. The spoilers that have been mentioned in previous presentations that are not just in the conflict context, but also in the region and internationally. This may mean that we're talking about slow transitions that are derailed, just along the lines of what Summit was discussing. And for the mediation community, it's, as Christine said, it means even more that these transitional periods are even more negotiation spaces. The negotiation continues, and it continues not only with the members of the transitional governments, not only with actors within the countries, but also continues at the international level. So the main point here is that the internationalization of civil wars and conflicts basically spills over to the internationalization of conflict through this transition period. The second point that I wanted to make is a risk that I feel is prevalent in these processes, but the scholars among you may correct me. And that is the risk that sometimes we go through transitional governments, transitional arrangements, simply go through the motions of transition, but actually don't go through any meaningful, difficult negotiations on the substantive issues, the controversial issues, the disputed issues that they have to resolve in order to move forward. And it's possible that this is colored a little bit through my experience in Yemen after the 2011 agreement. And Yemen went for about 3 years through a beautiful transition on paper. There was an election for a transitional president. There was an agreement for a power-sharing government. The government was appointed, supposedly met and functioned. There was a preparation for a national dialogue conference. That national dialogue conference took place and functioned for a good 10 months. But if you looked at closely at what was happening, people were not actually negotiating anything meaningful. They were going through the motions of transition. They were going through the landmarks that were put for them through the transitional agreement, the 2011 implementation mechanism, but actually didn't do any hard work of resolving any of the issues when it came to real, meaningful power sharing with the Houthis or the status of the South. And I have the feeling that this is probably a phenomenon that we see throughout these transitional arrangements. So not necessarily that they fail to agree, but they don't even try in meaningful way to resolve problems. And the trap here for the international third-party mediator, peacemaker, is that they are basically participating in political theater. And then you're constantly asking yourself whether to exit, whether to condemn, whether to participate, whether to prod, whether you have any tools, any cards and sticks to make this more meaningful. But essentially, you run the risk of participating in political theater. The third point that I wanted to make that also has been made is that these transitional arrangements are basically, of course, beautiful moments to expand political participation. And that makes them even more, again, periods and spaces for continued negotiations. So to expand political participation to armed actors that did not have the benefit of participating in the negotiation of these transitional arrangements, but also equally importantly, to expand participation to civil society, to women, to youth. Usually the negotiations of these transitional arrangements are very elite, limited. The legitimacy issues that Summit talked about in detail are important, but where they came from, who put them in place, with what basis. And so the transitional periods are very interesting moments, and where expansion of participation is possible. So in a way, where we are now in Libya is exactly that moment. There is a Libyan government, and the question is, can there be more participation from unarmed actors in the next 12 months in designing the electoral law, in thinking about the constitutional basis, so that you build a stronger basis and foundation for the next stage of the transition in Libya. So these were some of the basic comments, reflections from the perspective of a peacemaking practitioner that I wanted to share on these transitional arrangements that follow negotiated interim agreements. And then I wanted to just throw on the table, and you can just tell me that it's really not relevant to our discussion, but I want to throw to the table the whole question of transitional arrangements that are put in place after unconstitutional changes of government that clearly are not negotiated, are imposed by militaries, clearly don't have the legitimacy that we have been talking about. However, make promises. They make promises of reforms, and they make promises of a return to the democratic dispensation. Let's share an example. The example of Thailand in 2014, where there was the military coup that followed the violent protests and street contests between the so-called yellow shirts and red shirts. And that coup put in place something called the National Council for Peace and Order, very appropriately military-sounding title, that took upon itself all legislative authority, put in place single-handedly an interim constitution. So no basis there, no even pretension for participatory methods of deciding what the transitional process will be about, but leaving a tiny bit of political space open for some debate, putting in place a legislature that had a bit, I don't want to exaggerate, but had some diversity in it. And then had the ambition, supposedly, to bring the country back to a democratic process. So from the peacemaking community's perspective, the question is, what is the role of the expert community and the peacemaking community in these situations? It's a question fraught with ethical dilemmas. I think the way that at least my organization, and I know others, have dealt with it is to agree among ourselves what are our red lines, what we're willing to do, who we're willing to talk to, and what not to. And then to work with local actors who may be asking for support in order to convene informal dialogues among political actors and between political actors and military actors, with the hope of influencing positively these transitional processes. But I just wanted to thought it would be useful to throw that at the table, because we may be, as international community, witnessing a few more of those situations, which are not necessarily going to be the Myanmar scenarios, but they may be closer to the Thai scenarios. And I think at least for us as practitioners, it would be super useful for the academic brains to help us think through about our role in these situations. Thank you.